Welcome back, my friends, to a new journey into the events of the Warhammer 40K universe after the irreparable loss of the fortress world of Cardia, who held back the Eye of Terror and all the dark forces within it at bay for millennia, at the cost of billions of the bravest men and women, warriors of the Imperium, whose courage light the way of every fighter and soldier, protecting the Imperium and bringing the fight to the enemy to this very day. The destruction of the Cadian pylons by the heretic warmaster Abaddon. The despoiler on the 13th Black Crusade would change the Imperium forever, as after this devastating blow to the very fabric of real space would engulf the galaxy in terrible warp storms that would come turn off the light of the Astronomicon, in the Great Blinding, as some would come to call it, splitting the Imperium in half. Imperium Sanctus, as it remains blessed by the light of the Emperor in order to travel the warp, and Imperium Nihilus, now effectively cut off, as no astropathic messages can come or go, and there is no light to guide the Imperium fleets, leaving planets, systems, and whole sectors abandoned for decades. It is now where we, before diving into the very grave events of VIGILUS, must stop because, as the Imperium has been split in half, there were passageways untainted between the now split-apart parts of the Imperium, one of which is the Nachmund Gauntlet. The Gauntlet went from the world of VIGILUS in the Imperium Nihilus through the barrier of the Great Rift to the planet of Sangua Terra in the Imperium Sanctus, the half of the Imperium of Man that is still open to the light of the Astronomicon. The Nachmund Gauntlet is kept in place by large spears of polarized blackstone ore found in the planetary crusts of VIGILUS and Sangua Terra. Their anti-psychic effect pushed back the effects of the warp rifts that were pushing against the gauntlet from both sides. And here lies the importance of VIGILUS, and how it is now one of the most defended worlds of the entire Imperium of Man. And know this, our story begins. Join me, my friends, as we carry the light of the Emperor. If you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe for more and make your voice heard in the comments. As you are part of this community, and all our thoughts are part of what makes this universe so unique, let's dive into it. Our story begins with the development of the Great Rift. In the dark days preceding the terrible war to come, the galaxy witnessed a celestial disaster of unprecedented dimensions. The cicatrix maledictum, the nightmarish warpstorm, erupted from the Eye of Terror, carrying all the pain and all the billions of lives sacrificed in the defense of Cardia, that ultimately fell. But it fell fighting to the very end. All of this fell into the warp, tearing the cosmos apart from the northwest to the southeast sectors. The Great Rift was such a devastating phenomenon. It was a cataclysmic scar across the heavens seen as a scarlet gash. The fissure disrupted the galaxy's tranquility, leaving only a few perilous transport lanes around its vital point. VIGILUS, a planet caught in the path of the storm, was anticipated to be devoured whole, as most of the Imperial citizens, in their billions that dwell beneath the ground in the many hive cities that populate the planet, started to experience dark visions and horrific nightmares, as the very skies of the planet turned into a grim dark purple. A very dark omen was whispered within the underhives. Doom that exceeds all expectations for VIGILUS. This was in the minds of Segmentum Command. Despite this, VIGILUS survived the cosmic firestorm. For some reason yet not revealed, the massive warp storm that split the Imperium in half did not touch VIGILUS. Against all odds, its one-of-a-kind aegis held tight, protecting it from the rift's hungry maw. It cut out a lifeline, a key corridor known as the Nachmound Gauntlet, with the planets of Daravar that is located within the Gauntlet, and Sangua Terra located in Imperium Sanctus, on the other side, connecting VIGILUS, now in Imperium Nihilus, to the Imperium, the sole safe link enabling access to that side of the Imperium. Even the most specialized and veteran members of the Adeptus Mechanicus couldn't figure out how this galaxy pathway survived. Some attributed it to the Emperor's unyielding divine will, as he, from the Golden Throne, might have used his psychic might to give some respite to humanity, while others attributed it to a fortuitous quantum paradox or an unfathomable cosmic event. The truth was immaterial, regardless of the facts, as the galaxy holds many secrets not yet revealed, even to the Mechanicus. What mattered was that this path served as a beacon of hope, a frail thread connecting the Imperium's operational core, now named Imperium Sanctus, to the desperate remote parts of the Imperium Nihilus. VIGILUS's strategic importance grew, as it is expected, being a vital point to sail across the massive and dark warp storms, attracting the attention of both Imperium loyalists and traitors, as well as the opportunistic, covetous eyes of aliens, heretics, and mutants, as they all saw its critical role in this new reality. Threats erupted from every forgotten nook and cranny of the celestial map. Everyone knew how important VIGILUS is, and they knew it was worth waging war for it. Drukhari armies erupted through an Arctic webway portal, and ambassadors from craft world Saim Han arrived delivering foreboding prophecies and unending terror for Imperial citizens on VIGILUS, as now the threats continue to increase. As a result of this, VIGILUS was thrust into a darker era, even worse than after the Great Rift, with its swarming hive cities and bleak desert wastelands shaded by the ever-present warp gap in the sky, a grim forerunner of anarchy and turmoil. Any sort of order had been lost in the populated sections, and survivors mostly hid away in concealed stations or underhive dwellings. In the face of discontent and challenges to authority, the planet's rulers exercised their power with a blood-soaked iron grip, establishing draconian curfews and punishing non-compliance with ruthless efficiency, as it might be the only way to control the increasing spiral of anarchy and lawlessness that spread across the hives. And this is said even beyond the regular state of anarchy and lawlessness an Imperial hive has normally. Despite the brutality of these methods, their well-intended severity backfired, sending desperate citizens into the arms of hidden cults and subversive groups, sowing the seeds of future strife. Some of them were overt and obvious, while others were covert and hidden. As this happens, threats continue to mount up. VIGILUS, while not completely cut off from the Imperium, was confronted with a new scenario. The Great Rift, a haunting ghost especially noticeable at night, infiltrated every element of life and was beyond control, as most citizens suffering from demonic nightmares and some driven to insanity. Its affect was subtle, snatching sleep, twisting cognition, and even distorting the Adeptus Mechanicus's cogitator systems, making also Auspex sweeps erratic. Now a shadow is casted on detection instruments, making it almost impossible to know who comes near. Cowards fled in any way they were able to. Deep in the hives, citizens lost faith and turned to worship new dark idols, fleeing deep into the underhive, into dark cults. And the injured mutated and combined flesh with metal, transforming themselves into startling chaos abominations with black lass weapons, projecting sickly tentacles and armor adhering to their bodies. When chaos seeds took root on the very soil, it spread like wildfire reaching a dry forest. It spread as a red mist, leaving its imprint on any carbon-based life it came into touch with. The very nature of the planet began to get cursed. It shattered unity within families, twisted hearts of the faithful, distorted views of the very material reality they knew, fueled new ambitions for power where there wasn't before, and exaggerated anxieties and fears beyond comprehension. To prevent further contamination, harsher lockdowns were implemented across the hive cities, prohibiting inhabitants from leaving their homes after dusk as patrols increased. Regardless, the Great Rift's influence was felt far and wide. It engulfed the very existence of everyone on VIGILUS. Its serpentine form first appeared in the most unexpected places: feverish sketches of the insane, birthmarks on infants, and even natural events such as withering the soil, polluting the weather, and turning beasts into abominations. As the corruption spreads, the Imperium's holy Adeptus Ministorum, the Ecclesiarchy, worked tirelessly to remove these manifestations. Using harsh and severe punishment, such as interrogations for authorities high and low, and fiery faith tests for all who seem suspicious. Still, the phenomenon seemed to worsen, infiltrating deeper into the minds of VIGILUS's citizens. The planet was on the verge of disaster, plagued by nightmares and sleep deprivation. This condition of tension and conflict laid the groundwork for the many threats to come, as information spreads of VIGILUS and the importance of the Nachmound Gauntlet VIGILUS, forever in the shadow of the Great Rift, began a new chapter in its grim histories in this desolate environment. Despite its taint and spreading corruption, VIGILUS is still a planetary stronghold nestled on the distant fringes of the Nachmund Gauntlet. It was the Imperium's bulwark against the chaotic storm of the cicatrix maledictum. This attracted many refugees fleeing from the war that destroyed Cadia. The importance of this world to the survival of the Imperium was incalculable. None other than Reboot Guilliman, the Lord Commander of the Imperium himself, declared Vigilus indispensable. Vigilus cannot fall. Vigilus has been declared Sentinel World, and no resource will be spared in its protection. Vigilus is a sprawl of continent-sized hive cities, each teeming to the brim with refugees seeking respite from the unimaginable horrors besieging the worlds of the Imperium Nihilus. Each city sprawl is safeguarded by potent Bastion-class force fields charged with psychic energy. These formidable barriers render invaders comatose, allowing the defenders to cull them with dispassionate efficiency. Little did they know that such formidable defenses were fated to confront the most brutal of enemies. As the corruption of the warp continued to torment the people of Vigilus, and chaos spreads in the underhives and anarchy increases everywhere, the very taint that made the instruments of the Mechanicus unreliable made Vigilus authorities unable to know the threat that had already landed on their planet, the Orcs. The Orc fleet easily ripped through Vigilus's naval defensive cordon, then crash-landed its wretched ships in the immense deserts between hive sprawls, as the rift scrambled the planet's astropaths and psychers to try and send emergency messages pleading for aid, the primal terror that was the Speedwa. An expansive wave of Orc devastation under the banner of the insanity of the Speed Freaks bore down on Vigilus, demented Orcs even for greenskins, addicted to the speed of their bikes and other ratchet vehicles. Huge rolling nightmares now roam and muster outside the hives. The Orc armada, spit forth by the maw of the Great Rift, as though vomited out by some grotesque cosmic warp beast, had no specific planetary target in its path of destruction, as this is how the Orc Manus crash landed on Vigilus. The maddening eddies of the rift had thrown the planet's astropaths and psychers into a cacophonous turmoil, leaving the impending disaster unheralded. With impunity and unrivaled, the Orc fleet shattered Vigilus's naval shield, crash-landing their hulking vessels into the vast and barren expanses of the desert between the gargantuan hive sprawls. Some of these vessels, swaddled in the protective embrace of bubble-like force fields, endured the impact, while others were obliterated on contact. The surviving ships, though, became the beating heart of hastily erected Orc scrap cities that have since been the seedbeds of relentless Orc incursions into the hive world. In the grip of the Great Rift's aftermath, the defenders of Vigilus watched on, a paralyzed audience watching the rise of these scrap cities, grotesque monstrosities made from the crashing Orc spaceships, now repurposed in typical Orcy fashion into fortresses, vehicles, and weapons, as they now occupy a large part of the Vigilus wastes. When the war drums of the Orcs sounded their readiness, Speed Boss Cruel Daka rose to lead a formidable tide of bikes, trucks, and wagons, now expanding and hunting for prey as they saw the immense hive sprawls as great prizes open for the taking. Initially, the Orc war machine found itself stymied by the Bastion-class force fields, their emerald luminescence encapsulating each Vigilus hive sprawl, as long columns of speed boys crashed into the force field and kept shooting at it with no effect. This impasse of the attack of Speed Boss Cruel Daka led the Greenskins to turn their attention to the desert-crossing caravans, desperate ensembles of vehicles of trade and transport across the hives, traveling on the surface, ripe for plundering and to engage in wild battles and races amidst the vast dust storm known as the Vulian Swirl. However, as the Great Rift gorged itself, warp storms washed over Vigilus like a tidal surge once again, leading to the failure of some of the protective force fields, leaving the hives unprotected from the incoming Orc threat. In a matter of hours, the Orcs flooded each city, teetering on the precipice of a total rout of the Imperial Guard, PDF, the Sisters of Battle, and the Mechanicum's Skitari lines of defense. The biodome sprawl of Mortwald II fell under their onslaught, with its rejuvenating complexes and verdant forests falling prey to the ravenous Orc tide. The force field still working in this city stood their ground even when a rampaging Wag, led by the relentless warlord Speedlord, directed his forces against the Imperium headquarters. However, with the ongoing warp storms, the force fields could not be relied on as before, as its protection could not be assured as it would go down with the warp surges. The impenetrable barriers that still managed to work at times repelled the Greenskins' assaults on the hive sprawls, driving them to seek bloody amusement in violent races across the expansive plains separating the sprawling hive cities. But they would come back, as they knew the force fields failed when the warp storms came, so it was only a matter of time. As the warp storm continued to be more frequent, the Great Rift's emergence began to strain the resilient Bastion-class force fields. Glitches became frequent, and eventually the protective barriers fell everywhere on the planet, leaving the hives vulnerable to attack. Worse yet, the tide of orcs surging past the defunct force field networks set in motion a chain of unforeseen catastrophic events, even with the continued orc attacks on the now unprotected hive cities. A hidden gene sect of the Pauper Prince's Genestealer cult, known ominously as the Claw of the Thirsting Worm, had been festering in the underbelly of Vigilus for countless Terran orbits, just waiting for their opportunity. Most of its brethren had never seen the stars until their brutal insurgency brought them into the harsh light of the surface, nestled in the labyrinthine abyss under the militarized reservoir of Grygon Hollow. And in an unexpected turn of events for their plans, the onslaught of the Orc War. Besieging Vigilus's hive cities had inadvertently hastened the cult's plans, as now seemed to be their chance. Their perfectly planned uprising, which was supposed to take place in a few more solar months, was launched early, as this unexpected Orc invasion could not go to waste. They would rise at this moment from the depths of the caves in the Underhive to go for everything. It was the time. The Adeptus Mechanicus Skitarii forces, dressed in their signature crimson and steel, put up a valiant fight. Their roving kill teams scored several early triumphs against the newly discovered menace. Despite this, every attempt to track down the Genestealer cult's hideout was futile. The Aquiliarian Council, Vigilus's ruling body, was on the verge of collapse, besieged by both foreign and internal alien threats. A SOS call rang out across the galaxy, pleading for help. As the threats continue to mount, the Great Rift and all its corruption, now the Xenos Greenskins hordes, and the Genestealer cult rising on the hives. Vigilus was doomed if the Genestealer cults continued to hold a blade to their throats, as threats are now from all sides at the same time. It was then that the first Space Marines arrived on Vigilus in the form of the Iron Hands and the Brazen Claws. Originally en route to the Stygius Crusade, they redirected their efforts after learning of the crisis for their Mechanicum allies and hearing the Vigilus pleads for help. The Iron Hands and Brazen Claws were led by Cardan Stronos, the de facto chapter master of the Iron Hands, who launched a drop pod landing in the fringe strategic zones of every remaining Imperial hive sprawl, but quickly making its way towards Hive Mega Borealis. Expecting to find greenskins, they instead encountered mostly Genie Stealers cultists amid their uprisings. The Imperial Guard and Sister of Battle forces that had attempted to counter these incursions usually had their convoys swallowed by massive sinkholes before being torn apart by the Genestealer monstrosities below, as the Genestealers had puppets in Imperial Guard command, leading thousands of guardsmen and allies into traps for their numbers to thin out, making it less affecting against them. With much of Vigilus's air support focused on the Orcs, the Genestealers were able to gain a substantial foothold within many hive sprawls. Vigilus's frantic appeals for help would not go unanswered as a howl is heard in the depths of space and a blade cuts the warp. More help was coming to Vigilus. The Space Wolves flagship forged a passage through the Orc-infested flotilla spinning menacingly in orbit after breaching the stormy Vigilus airspace. Strike Force Icepelt fell, with planned precision, into the beleaguered surface of Vigilus, ushering in a new chapter in the never-ending fight. The Space Wolves achieved breakthroughs that even the Adeptus Mechanicus's most intricate machinery had failed to secure, thanks to their astonishingly keen senses, a distinctive trait imbued by the Canis Helix, inherent in the gene seed of the Space Wolves chapter, and the innate hunting prowess bequeathed by their feral homeworld of Fenris. A potent strike group from Ragnar Blackmane's great company of Space Wolves was thrown wildly astray on the way to reinforce the beleaguered Imperial forces, which were engaged in furious combat with the Chaos-spawned creatures desecrating the Stygius sector. Icepelt ordered the helm of his spaceship, the Wind of Fimnia, to change course as soon as Vigilus's distress signal pierced the inky blackness of space. The battle leader, aware of the strategic implications, grasped the devastating implications of VIGILUS's fall. It would render any retreat from the Stygius sector a pipe dream, and thus, it could not be allowed to happen. Haldor Eispelt, the tenacious Primaris Space Marine battle leader, was at the helm. The Space Wolves, upon their arrival, immediately attacked the Genestealer uprising, shown uncanny prowess in driving the scattered elements of the Genestealer cults back into the murky depths from which they had emerged. Within a few solar days, the Space Wolves were hot on the trail of another enigmatic Genestealer cult, the nefarious cult of the Pauper Princes. This enigmatic threat had baffled the Vigilus defenders for countless solar months, but their days of covert operations were coming to an end. The reality of the Genestealer danger was brutally exposed in Greigen Hollow's barren metropolis, as Eispelt and his band of tough warriors faced the enemy. The genuine struggle for Vigilus's existence erupted here, in the echo of the devastated metropolis, showing the utter scope of the threat they faced. A brutal dance of destruction and survival had begun as a test of will and resilience. The commanding Magos Dominus of Hive Celerus Ipluvius XIV was preoccupied by his studies and overconfident in his own defenses at the Mechanicum stronghold of Mega Borealis, allowing a team of Orc commandos to penetrate and identify a weak point in the Hive Sprawl's force fields. A major Orc speed freak onslaught followed. As of now, the Hive's force fields that managed to stay up had been sabotaged by Orc commandos. The cogitator of Ipluvius XIV froze under the pressure, and the leaderless Skitarii were attacked not just by the Orcs, but also by the Genestealer cultists of the Claw of the Thirsting Worm, who rose simultaneously under the command of Slygax the Prophet, once again using the Orc attack to rise once again from the depths of the Hive. The cultists were able to grab vortex missiles and detonate them in the heart of the Hive sprawl, wiping out many of the defenders' assets, enormous caches of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and gear of all kinds, including the warlord titan Dominus Rex, dealing a great blow to the Loyalists' defenders. Archmagos Nessium Caldric had already placed Ipluvius XIV in stasis and taken his position. This replacement had been done after the failure of the Magos Dominus. His arrogances costed the Hive too much, and its fate hung by a thread. He was able to cooperate with the Iron Hands Kargul clan to halt the Genestealer momentum after bitter battle, demonstrating his ability as a decisive commander. By this point, the Imperial Guard had launched a large-scale counterattack in collaboration with the Imperial Navy's Valkyrie and Vendetta squadrons. Many of the sorties were escorting fuel and supply convoys to besieged outposts, although the end goal was to reinforce Mega Borealis. Thanks to artillery assistance, the Guard's armoured convoys of Lehman Russ battle tanks and chimeras wreaked havoc on the Orcs they encountered. This, however, merely served to draw more Orc speed freaks and overrun Imperial Guard formations by sheer numbers, another trap set by the Genestealer infiltrators within its high command. The 121st Goliath Armoured Battle Group was annihilated at the Battle of Morning Gorge by the Orc speedster Fragbad Squigbiter after he set off after recklessly attacking a Death Strike missile with stick bombs. The battle guaranteed that adjacent Hivesprawl Storval was besieged and that an important Imperial supply route was severed. Meanwhile, on its lowest depth, the tight slums of Hivesprawl Dontoria were already under the pressure of unknown assailants that to high command at this point could be more Genestealers or Orc commandos or anyone. To make matters worse, they got rumours of an unknown vessel approaching Vigilus security cordon. The Loyalist defender wasted no time into firing the massive defence lasers to the sky constantly to destroy the new invader. Despite being shot upon by defending anti-spacecraft batteries, the ship crashed into the centre of the Dontoria hives, unleashing the Gellerpox infected into its congested depths. What happened next, though, was even worse, as a Death Guard detachment appeared in the wake of the infected. As the crashed invading ship carried a deadly plague, the sons of Mortarion had arrived. Though the local Tempestus scions of the 98th Lambdic Oxen and Arbitrators were able to restrain the infected, the Chaos Space Marine assault quickly overpowered them. Faced with defeat, Tempest Aniod directed that the lower floors be firebombed within a 2-mile radius. The 98th retreated after the pitiless act seemed to work. However, A peculiar illness soon spread throughout Dontoria's districts, revealing that the Imperials had failed to restrain Nurgle's adherents. Despite the warnings of rogue trader Delaric du Languille, who had dealt with epidemics before, the Aquilarian Council was sluggish to respond. The very relaxed responses to the continued attacks on Vigilus started to worry the Imperial High Command at this point, as there was no sense of urgency. Meanwhile, on his way to Venatus, Nympha Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines had a dream vision from Chief Librarian Tigurius's astral projection. The vision featured an order from Primarch Robut Guilliman not to let Vigilus die under any circumstances. The journey to Vigilus was difficult for the Ultramarines, despite Tigurius's mental direction in place of navigators, who would have gone insane attempting to identify the world. Several epistolaries with Tigurius died because of the ritual, but it was successful in transporting the Ultramarines to Vigilus on time. Vigilus cannot fall. The Ultramarines landed quickly across Vigilus, with Calgar himself landing at St. Haven to meet with the Aquilarian Council. Many other chapters would go directly to the enemy, and the Ultramarines did. But the Sons of Guilliman are warrior statesmen, and the chapter master of the Ultramarines went to the council to know what was going on. Calgar quickly detected that many of the imperial bureaucrats of the council were quickly to dismiss the very obvious threats, and they turned to everyday meaningless politician banter. But Calgar was a veteran exposed to the tyrannid menace, and he had learned through the centuries to detect the signs of the Genesteel occultists, and after the formalities of presenting himself, he was attacked. But, as he already suspected, his theoretical scenario was true, and his Victrix Guard was more ready than the corrupted council, and a microsecond after the signs of corruption were confirmed, Calgar gave the sign, and his accompanying marines executed them all, wasting no time. Calgar abolished the council and replaced it with the Senatorum Vigilius, the Vigilus Senate in its place. It is formed by the heads of the various imperial adepti present in the sector and the final executive authority short of terror within Vigilius. The threat of the Pauper Prince's Genesteel cults has been pushed back into the shadows, thanks to Haldor Icepelt's relentless efforts. Vigilus breathed a sigh of relief, but the respite was temporary, as the shadow of misunderstanding and age-old disputes pulled the spectre of conflict back over the critical world. The Craftworld's Eldari have always been a race touched by visions and foresight, endowed with the ability to see into the strands of the future. As the Great Rift ripped the galaxy apart, every Craftworld was caught up in a desperate race to weave a favorable pattern into the threads of fate. The fate of their race was at stake, spurring frantic lightning strikes and clandestine plots to ensure their survival. In their quest to protect their race, the Wild Riders of Saimhan perceived disaster coming on Vigilus. They sent out a hit group with a lethal mission: murder Vanadin the Firebrand, a rising demagogue whose speeches have influenced hundreds of Vigilus residents towards the alluring anarchy. The mission was beautifully completed, but success did not come cheap. The saviors from Saimhan were confronted with revenge from the imperial forces they had supported due to a catastrophic misreading of their intentions. The reaction was quick and ruthless. The Eldari were labeled aggressors, and their forces were pushed into a brutal retreat, bearing the spirit stones of their fallen and a burning passion for vengeance in their hearts. Spiritia Kelnaris of Saimhan unleashed his rage on the forces protecting the Imperium, seeking retribution for the wrongs done to his species, the primaris space marines of the Ultramarines. Chapter Sons of Ultramar remained firm against his attack. Furthermore, other Eldari factions have set their sights on Vigilus. The planet had become a beacon for the countless refugees attempting to cross the Nachmound Gauntlet. The governing Drukhari cabal of the Black Heart, who had previously destroyed entire flotillas of these civilian spacecraft, began seizing their human cargo and transporting them to the horrors of Comora. Meanwhile, Space Marine Chapter Necropolis Hawks had landed in Dontoria and were currently collaborating with rogue trader de Languille to try to contain the Gellerpox afflicted. Meanwhile, the Crimson Fists, led by Captain Germandes, collaborated with the Iron Hands to build the ultimate anti-plague barrier. The Necropolis Hawks and Crimson Fists fought chaos mutant creatures at the disused Litmus Dock. The Crimson Fists utilized hellhounds from the adjacent Vigilant Guard to set fire to the Hive Sprawl's Prometheum pipelines, establishing a true firewall around the afflicted zone. Despite the violence and bloodshed, Calga's Vigilus Senate was doing a good job of organizing the war effort on Vigilus, and the public was starting to believe that they could reclaim the planet, acting quickly and in force, with a great sense of urgency that had been lost under the former Aquila Council, making a fast decision, and of course, a basic one, in securing supplies and strategic locations right away. This was despite Calga's decision to leave Dirkton when the chapter master deemed the situation there unwinnable. He led a large evacuation of Dirkton's hive civilian population, utilizing the Crimson Fists as a shield against Cruel Daka's orcs and his speed freaks. If that wasn't enough, when the chapter master of the Ultramarines was beginning to grasp the control of Vigilus, a new menace to Vigilus originally appeared in the form of odd vox emissions and strange visions. The great rift above Vigilus darkened. The population of the hives, now plagued by Xenos, cultists and complete anarchy, began a new stage of nightmares and desperation. Reports of people randomly going insane increased dramatically. Psychers stated that the Emperor's Tarot consistently revealed the same card, the Demon Blade crossed with the Herald of Darkness and the Knight of the Abyss. Reports of abductions and strange monsters in the top spires proliferated. Investigators found grotesque scenes, and the rumors of chaos cults coming out of every deep corner of the hive started to spread. Those assigned to investigate the latter accusation were never seen again. Only the Tsinchian chaos cultists understood these indicators for what they were, an impending chaos invasion. The Vigilus Senate had grown concerned by the increased activity of strange giant flying creatures in Vigilus's tallest spires by this point. It was a bad omen, it was whispered atop the spires. The mumblings of comatose imperial psychers were translated by Inquisitor Frenza of the Ordo Malleus, who confirmed that they spoke in Chaos's black speech, announcing the approach of a Dark King. Calga soon realized that mayhem was erupting over Vigilus itself. The enemies above Vigilus were quickly identified as Chaos Raptors, Helldrakes, and Warp Talons scouting ahead of their main force. This blasphemous army was led by Harkon Worldclaimer, also known as the Herald of the Apocalypse. Worldclaimer announced his entrance on Vigilus by broadcasting his demon-linked box network over the whole planet, reaching the consciousness of every single soul. He declared that Vigilus now belonged to Warmaster Abaddon the Despoiler, and that he would be there shortly to claim it. A huge Helldrake burst through the Senate Spire's glass ceiling as Calga convened an emergency meeting of the Vigilus Senate to tackle this new menace. A huge massacre ensued. Firefights started instantly as the Senate Guard fired at the creatures to no avail. Calgar and his Victrix Guard fought off and managed to rescue as many as possible from the Senate Spire, while the Ultramarine Chapter Master fought to the very end. He was only rescued by his Victrix Guard, as he would have kept fighting until death, while there was no win condition now. Far to the south, Thousand Suns Rubicae units were spotted among the remains of Kylax Bane, breaching the Otek Hive Sprawl's force field during a normal shutdown to wreak havoc behind Imperial lines. An armoured assault was led by Lord Commissar Barthold Dorst to repel the Rubicae, but they were unable to deal with their warp-fire weaponry. Meanwhile, a new Gellerpox outbreak erupted in Mortwald, and the Hive Sprawl elites huddled inside their spires with all the food and water they could gather. Mortwald's labourers died slowly over the next few months, abandoned and without food or drink. The Chaos and Genestealer troops exploited this atrocity, inciting desperate labourers to revolt against Imperial authority. The cries and agony of horrors that had yet to occur but would soon befall them overloaded Vigilus's Vox traffic. Harkon claims he will rule the world in 80 days. The worst was yet to come, as word spread that Abaddon the Despoiler was also on his way to Vigilus, at the helm of a vast Chaos armada. Calga was shocked by the news that the renowned Warmaster of Chaos had returned, even in the middle of this massive attack coming from all sides on Vigilus. But he replied decisively. He recalled the vision from the Lord Commander. Vigilus cannot fall, he thought, dispatching his most powerful Void Fleet assets to intercept the impending Black Legion forces. The Chaos Raptor hordes, backed by the demon engines of Harkon, were already on the surface of Vigilus and had now broken cover to openly attack the Imperial forces. Above Hyperia Hive Sprawl, Imperial and Chaos forces clashed, and Calga devised a plan to flee the planet, leaving the defenses to Pedro Cantor of the Crimson Fists. Calga intended to travel to Nemengast aboard his flagship, the Laurels of Victory, to learn what had happened to the strike group he had sent there. Calgar encountered a Black Legion fleet led by the legendary Vengeful Spirit himself after a week's trek into the void at the location specified by Vanguard Librarian Maltus. Calgar, together with Arch-Commodore Hentzman, ordered his fleet to create a double line to meet the coming Black Legion armada. Despite using a salvo of torpedoes to box in the Chaos vessels, Abaddon's vessels dived directly into the Imperial fleet. Chaos forces were able to conjure demons headed by a Keeper of Secrets on board the Laurels of Victory, an act of treachery that Calgar only survived thanks to his Victrix guard. Though Calgar survived, albeit wounded, there was word that similar boardings had occurred across the fleet. With Calgar injured and under the care of his apothecaries and the Imperial fleet in disarray, Commodore Hentzman was obliged to order a retreat to Vigilus. Abaddon had opened the road to Vigilus with a single stroke, breaking the Imperial defensive lines with strategic boarding actions, showing his tactical prowess. Calgar returned to Vigilus, and the situation was dire to say the least. Enemies kept coming, and from all sides, the threat grows everywhere. He decided to abandon Hive Dirkton to the Genestealer cultists and Kalax Bane to the Dark Elder, as he had to prioritize the defense of strategic points that had a chance in the current situation. Mortwald was still barely holding out against orcs in its lower levels and chaos raptors in its spires. Megaborealis was under attack from the Pauper Prince's Genestealer cult, and the Omniscient Hoist water delivery relay was already in Genestealer hands. Dontoria was plagued by Nurgle's plagues, and Otek's reservoirs was the site of a fierce battle between the Pauper Princes, Raptor gangs, Space Wolves, Deathwatch, and Sisters of Battle. Storval was in the hands of the Sons of Vanadin, and its 3 volcanoes were spewing billions of tons of ash into the air, scorching defenders on the ground and masking raptor movements. The arrival of Abaddon's armada would push Vigilus over the edge. Despite Imperial propaganda declaring Calgar's victory, put in place in order not to plunge the Imperial citizens and Loyalist troops even in more disarray, the Chaos fleet arrived in Vigilus's orbit, with Abaddon at the helm. Looting and rioting were prevalent in the Imperial-held sprawls because of the arrival. Desperation completely took over the population that had experienced so much terror and anarchy so far. They were pushed to a breaking point. Many of the hopeless and insane population rallied under the banner of Chaos, or Broodmind. Others joined the Imperial cult, and flocked to the Ecclesiarchy and Adepta Sororitas in large numbers, seeking salvating in the Emperor's light in these desperate times. The fanatical zealot hordes aided and hindered Imperial armies as throngs of now fanatical citizens of the hives that had lost it all, now formed zealous mobs with nothing to lose and an extreme hatred for all the Xenos and enemies of all kinds that had attacked them for so long. The people of Vigilus had enough and decided to fight back in any way they could. Abaddon, on the other hand, had not anticipated so many Xenos in the planet, as he was shocked so many Greenskins and Eldar were already there. As Chaos troops sought to take the hive sprawls from the top down, they were met with strengthened Genestealer armies of the Pauper Princess and Orcs on each one. Forced to redeploy and alter their strategy, Harkon sent the Night Lords and Scourged under Ramagan Savasdus and Varianus to attack Dirkton, the Genestealer stronghold. When the Night Lords made planetfall, they killed their way through Dirkton's streets, slaughtering both regular sinners and Genestealer fanatics. Resistance proved to be more difficult than anticipated, and the heretic Astartes were soon battling for their lives against Genestealer ambushes across the hives under the command of Primus Holland Desh. Even though the Night Lords slaughtered many cultists, wave after wave attacked their lines, the heretics had clearly not prepared for scale of the problems in Vigilus. The Night Lords were eventually defeated by a decisive attack commanded by Aberrants and Metamorphs, and Scourged and Dirkton remained in the hands of the Pauper Princes. Meanwhile, Imperial forces were prepared to seize the Omniscient Hoist, a critical water delivery relay station that had been sent into Vigilus's orbit. In the Imperium's planets, most of them have hives, where water is the most precious commodity, and access to clean water is a luxury few can afford. Without this, Imperial efforts would soon be in vain. Megaborealis Hive was already dehydrated and the situation had deteriorated massively. The assault was spearheaded by Mechanicus and Iron Hands under Captain Galkran. Battling through Orc and Genestealer forces equally, orbital bombardment from the strike cruiser Darkspear was able to rip a path through the Genestealer horde and let Mechanicus Legio Cybernetica soldiers to roll through into the lower levels. Meanwhile, Skitarii forces were entrusted with capturing the top levels from pure strain Genestealers. The Imperial's assault went successfully, and Grandsire Worm himself emerged through the hoist's pipelines, the obscure leader of the Genestealers finally revealed. Grandsire Worm reorganized the Genestealers and led a major counterattack. The Genestealer Patriarch was able to shut himself into the hoist's primary control center, but he was attacked by Onager dune crawlers that had climbed up the building without notice. Grandsire Worm was injured and forced to leave, and the dune crawler assault entirely cleared the upper levels of Genestealers. The Wordbearers were also on Vigilus, because at this point, with the arrival of Abaddon, who isn't on Vigilus, they had now launched a frenzied fanatical assault on Hyperia Hivesprawl, aided by Iron Warriors dropped from low-orbiting vessels upon its peaks. The Iron Warriors were able to coordinate pinpoint fire against the Fortress of Redemption. Despite a counterattack by the Imperial Fists, the structure stood against the Orcs for many years, before succumbing to the Chaos Space Marine Siege Masters. Meanwhile, the Night Lords, heavily decimated by the Genestealers, launched another assault on Dirkden, this time targeting the Imperial Hyperia Dirkden fort wall to march south of Saints Haven. The Black Legion Archlord Discordant Vex Machinator led an assault against the Lenkot's Chain's water purification plants, and Dontoria was decimated by the Gelapox. Kalga was forced to take drastic measures after Lucien Agamemnus IX. If we don't remember who he is, he was the Imperial Planetary Governor of Vigilus before the arrival of Kalga. He is only kept a member of the Vigilus Senate because the Vigilant Guard is loyal to him. He persuaded Kalgar to unleash enormous fires at the throats of each of the greatest Hivesprawls. He reluctantly agreed to this scorched earth strategy, and Sisters of Battle fire crews set off large conflagrations known as Kalgar's fires. Vigilus spires burned down one by one. A scorched earth strategy was now in play. At the same time, the Vengeful Spirit, the vessel of Abaddon the Despoiler, and its escorts landed above Vigilus. The ancient spaceship assumed a geosynchronous position above Storval, decimating every Imperial Navy vessel that tried to confront it. Due to massive losses, the admirals of the Imperial Navy were eventually obliged to quit disputing the vessel's presence entirely. Abaddon's initial goal was to enter the Vulian Swirl, a gigantic storm that ravaged the areas east of Hyperia Hivesprawl. Abaddon and his Bringers of Despair teleported from the Vengeful Spirit to the Citadel Vigilant, an ancient structure at the heart of the swirl. The Citadel was now under the power of a warband of Fallen, led by former Dark Angels librarian Osandus. Since the conflict on Pandora, these Fallen had struck a contract with Abaddon. Abaddon coveted the might of the Voidclaw, an enormous ancient weapon at the heart of the Citadel. Using the weapon's tremendous gravity powers, the War Master attempted to modify the Nachmound Gauntlet by launching it into the space between Vigilus and its moon, Neovellum. The Voidclaw had a terrible effect on Vigilus when it was released. Everything on Vigilus was drawn towards the orbiting gravitic singularity, resulting in the Vulian anomaly, a degree of global catastrophe. The anomaly first affected the orbiting Imperial vessels, who were bewildered by the unexpected deployment of Chaos vessels. Though the Chaos ships were repositioned to positions where their engines could offset the effects of the anomaly, the Imperial fleet was unprepared for what hit them and was crushed and scattered by the gravitic forces that assailed them. On planet side, anything that wasn't fastened down was attracted towards the Vulian swirl, causing a problem that primarily impacted the ramshackle greenskins. Such forces caused the spires of Megaborealis, Hyperia, Dirkden, and Storval to collapse and fall. The planet's valuable water supply was also impacted, with much of it escaping those reservoirs still held by the Imperium and being absorbed into the surrounding environment. The corrosive marshes that had once been controlled on Vigilus's moon, Neovellum, overflowed across its surface, causing immense damage. Abaddon had delivered a crippling blow on the Vigilus system in a single act. Taking advantage of the disaster raging throughout Vigilus, the Wordbearers began constructing a massive number of Noctilith crowns to harness the power of the Great Rift blazing above. At the same time, the Death Guard spread their plagues throughout Dontoria, and the Night Lords renewed their assault on Dirkton. The Iron Warriors were excitedly confronting their own opponents, the Imperial Fists at Mortwold. The World Eaters were content to slay the Giants' Defenders, a series of crenellated plateaus in northern Otek. Others, such as the Alpha Legion, were involved in a variety of covert operations. The Chaos Forces, however, were not without opposition, and the reeling Calgar was able to begin a campaign of deception and entrapment. In a stratagem inspired by Cryptman's Gambit against Hive Fleet Leviathan, the Imperial forces aimed to push one opponent into another and obliterate them all by altering their foes' objectives. Just a small note here. The Cryptman's Gambit refers to legendary Inquisitor Cryptman's strategy against the Tyranids, where he aimed to pitch the Hive Fleet against a massive Orc empire. Calgar directed many Space Marine chapter masters engaged in conflict with the battle-hungry World Eaters, Crimson Slaughter, and Red Corsairs to launch a series of fighting retreats, luring the heretic Astartes out of the cities and into the streets. As the Space Marines were able to retreat via gunship and bulklanders, this caught the attention of the Orcs of the Speed War, who drove into the throng of Chaos Forces. Even the World Eaters were outnumbered on the open ground by the frantic and fast-moving Speed War. In a matter of hours, Abaddon attempted to destroy the Blackstone deposits guarded by the Mechanicum at Silo Femth at Megaborealis Thundersump, as he aimed to destroy the Nachmund Gauntlet passage. Abaddon attacked it with a swarm of demon engines and brazen creatures, shielded by a macro-grade refractor field. Cerberite, the half-living, corrupted brazen beast's battle barge, led the assault. Before uncoiling ridged pseudopods, the altered vessel pushed low into Vigilus's orbit and passed Silo 15th's refractor field. A swarm of daemon engines descended the ramps. There were 3 Lords of Skulls among this formidable force. Even the well-maintained Mechanicum garrison was overwhelmed by their numbers. The presence of the Cerberite, on the other hand, roused another foe, the Orcs of Cruel Daka, who had long harassed Megaborealis. The speed boss set off to explore the glowy object that had appeared above Megaborealis. Soon after, a vast horde of battle wagons and trucks bearing Big Tanker's creations blasted through the overstretched Skitarii lines surrounding Megaborealis and poured into Thundersump. The sudden presence of frantic greenskins slowed Chaos's approach and eventually brought it to a halt. The ruling and wealthy of the Hive Sprawl, led by Dinos Agamemnus, reacted to the approach of Chaos forces by hoarding as much food and water as they could find in Mortwold Hive. The elite in Immortalis Spire Hive have more food than they could devour in 100 lifetimes. These gluttonous kings were soon touched by Slanesh's touch in the shape of cults of luxury and immortality. A wave of unrest also hit Mortwold, which the Flawless Host took advantage of. When the Flawless Host arrived in Immortalis Spire Hive, he wanted to demonstrate Lord Dinos and his companions what true excess was all about. Hordes of demonettes were summoned, and each magnificent spire of Mortwold quickly burnt from within, revealing its rotting heart to everyone. Simultaneously, the starved inhabitants of Mortwold launched their own violent revolution. Khorne took great advantage of this, turning many insurgents into bloodthirsty cultists. Chaos, as it is born from humanity's emotions, takes strength from the very flaws of humanity to attack it. This is the true danger of chaos. The Death Guard, led by Plague Surgeon Zoculinsus, launched an attack in Dontoria's Pravda subsprawl district. Years before, despite rogue trader Delaric du Languille's best efforts, they had released the Galapox on the area and transported numerous afflicted freighters into orbit. 3 of these diseased freighters have returned to boost Nurgle's army now that the Chaos invasion has reached its climax. They landed at the Litmus Dock, which is now controlled by the Death Guard, and released waves of mutants of all sizes and shapes. However, this enraged the Purge, who were repulsed by what they witnessed unleashed at Dontoria in their drive to exterminate all impure biological life. The Purge arrived at the Great Choke and immediately began slaughtering people and Galapox infected alike, hurling their carcasses into the Great Choke's manufactories. Symmetria Subsprawl emitted a vile industrial miasma from the dead, suffocating every organic life it encountered. They continued their heretical work over the next 6 months, conquering entire districts of the Hive and repurposing their weaponry for extermination. Their pollution cloud spread, and Dontoria became A dead wasteland. Many Death Guard and Galapox were enraged by the Purge's abrupt intervention, and infighting among Nurgle's scions erupted across Dontoria. Even though it was a stalemate that not even Kalgar attempted to break, it was evident that Dontoria had fallen. It was clear that Vigilus's time was running out. The turmoil was gradually crushing the Imperial defenders, as there were all enemies on all fronts, inside and outside, this alongside the corrupted ruling class working against them out of greed. The carnage had caused the Great Rift to grow towards Vigilus, according to Neo-Vellum's surviving relay stations. An energy flood of chaos threatened to close the entire Nachmound Gauntlet. It was immediately evident that Abaddon's objective was to close the gauntlet and isolate the entire Imperium Nihilus from Terra's assistance. Faced with this bleak scenario, the Vigilus Senate debated the Vigilus war zone's abandonment and annihilation. Guilliman, on the other hand, had commanded that Vigilus was too important to be abandoned for any reason, and Kalgar dismissed such proposals. The Ultramarine Chapter. Master and Pedro Cantor from the Crimson Fists both stated that the Genestealers and Orcs had taken a significant toll on Chaos forces. Some triumphs were still being claimed, notably at Magentine Vales, when the Imperial Guard leader Nerog van Thryn misled his troops by using Orc mercenaries. I still can't believe how this even happened, to be honest. Despite his victory, he was executed for heresy by a commissar, though an alliance with the Orcs was out of the question. Kalgar did think about the Eldar he had fought on Vigilus. Kalgar himself joined the conflict at the Rings of Nothingness. During a brief respite in the combat, Kalgar requested parley with the Xenos and was met by Saimhan Farseer Anvir Keltok. Though the Farseer was eager to revenge Autarch Rylor's murder, he saw calamity for the Elder species if Vigilus fell. The Saimhan Elder, on the other hand, were not known for their forgiveness, and Kalgar still had a lot of negotiating to do. It's unclear how he secured their affiliation, but the Ultramarines chapter master finally succeeded in bringing the Xenos into an alliance with the Imperium through a secret contract that was never made public. 3 aspects of the transaction are known. Farseer Keltok and his senior chieftains led Kalgar back to the governor's palace first. Second, the Vigilus Senate's doors were barred and guarded by the Victrix Guard. Third, members of the Aquilarian Council, who presided over Rylor's death, were never seen again, including Lucien Agamemnus IX and Proctor Commander Venedar. All in all, none of value was lost. Kalgar wanted to employ the stealthy Eldar warship Vol's Ghost to strike a blow against the vengeful spirit now that he had it. Saimhan Eldar was able to lead Orcs at Hyperia towards Chaos Space Marine strongpoints around the planet, in a technique dubbed the Serpent's Lure, to distract Chaos forces from their true goal. These methods were used against the Black, Legion, Iron Warriors, and traitor titans of the Legio Decapitorum. Only Kalgar Keltok and a few Ultramarine commanders recognized that only the combat at New Vitae docks was important in the long run. Despite brutal Iron Warriors attacks, the Mortwald aerial base was sending every bulk lander it had into low orbit. Though much of the craft had nothing of note, 6 of them did have Deathstrike missiles, including 2 Vortex missiles. In orbit, the outmaneuvered Imperial fleet had been pieced back together by Kalgar and met the larger Chaos army to hide their true goal. Even though 80% of the Imperial ships were lost, the Vol's Ghost was able to meet with the Deathstrike missile-carrying vessels. The Eldar vessel then proceeded to the Vengeful Spirit. The stealthy ship was able to infiltrate Chaos ship lines and collide with the Vengeful Spirit. The Gloriana-class battleship's 6 Deathstrike missiles were all detonated, resulting in a huge explosion that ripped a gaping hole in its side, after dealing this heavy blow to the despoiler. Kalgar boldly challenged the War Master in person in the upper spires of Saints Haven, in a region known as the Eyrie of Reflection. He stood at its topmost summit, fighting against waves of Harkon Worldclaimers raptors with his personal guards, and goaded Abaddon through an Ecclesiarchy Vox array. Abaddon couldn't resist the impulse to disgrace the Ultramarines chapter master, even though he was still in the Citadel vigilant. He and his Terminator and possessed elite teleported right to Saints Haven, arriving before Kalgar and his entourage. As the two sides surged into each other, a struggle ensued. As the War Master and Chapter Master dueled to the death, the flaming spires above them turned the sky red-black, the clouds of smoke making odd and disturbing forms. Calga dodged and feinted, retreating behind fallen statues and rising again. Heracles' armor let him to move and react faster than any other warsuit he had worn. He prevented his opponent from wielding the lethal sword Drachnian by hammering out bolt rounds from the gauntlets of Ultramar. The Reavers, Suppressors and Scouts, observing through their gun sights, understood the Chapter Master was holding back on purpose, but none fired a shot. Calga's plan got closer to reality. With every second the two warriors spent testing one another, watching, and learning to pinpoint the best moment to strike. Forcing Abaddon to retreat now would jeopardize everything. Infuriated, Abaddon unleashed his combi bolter, sending explosive ammunition booming from the Talon of Horus to engulf Calga in a blaze. One of the flagstones came way under the Chapter Master's weight, and he was thrown off balance for a second. Abaddon appeared, body to body, his Talon of Horus ripping one of Calga's valuable gauntlets away, revealing a forearm fractured and stripped of skin. The Lord of Macragge hit his opponent in the face with his damaged fist, breaking his jaw. Calga's remaining power fist delivered a devastating uppercut that knocked Abaddon off his feet and cracked his armor. The War Master's face twisted in rage. The air shrieked around him, demonic effluvia tendrils licking like flames from his blade. Calga attempted to stop Drachnian with his gauntlet, but the sword cut right through it, severing two of Calga's fingers in the process. The blow ripped through the armor behind it, severing the major and secondary hearts of the Chapter Master in a single blow. Harken Worldclaimer summoned Abaddon via a coded voxlink as Calga collapsed. The vengeful spirit was badly wounded and on the verge of annihilation. It was performing an emergency warp translation, and they just had a few moments before it vanished from the VIGILUS system. The War Master's possessed fiends stalked towards Calga like scavengers nearing the carcass of a mighty beast. But the Lord Macragge lay cold as stone among the wreckage of the war, his skin as white as alabaster. The Chapter Master's hearts were punctured, and dark blood poured from the large fissure opened in his armor. Worse, the possessed were able to breach the Victrix Guard's formation, with one fallen creature clawing its way through to stand over him, claws raised. Any other Space Marine would have died right there. However, Lord Macragge's Belisarian furnace was activated within his massive breast. That remarkable organ blasted healing stimulants into his system, providing him with one more burst of energy before death completely took him. The Adeptus Astartes Innermight and Belisarius Call's Arcanoscience equaled the hellish forces of the Chaos Gods. Calga knelt as the Greater Possessed loomed over him, then stood up quickly. Although wounded, his remaining Ultramar Gauntlet was still functional. With a backhand hit, he knocked the beast away, then unleashed a barrage of explosive shots that blasted it apart, the device still cycling as it clicked empty. The powerful warrior then retreated, blood streaming from his wounds. The Victrix Guard and the remaining Extremis Guard swarmed around him, forming a shield and thudding death into the last of the possessed. The Storm Raven gunship Hope's blade descended from the clouds, its frontal hatches gaping to allow a pair of seasoned apothecaries to drop down to the flags. They dashed over to Calga, bringing their narthechiums to bear on his devastated system, filling it with stabilizing elixirs and life-giving suspensions of blessed vitae. Calga stood tall, his face distorted in an agonizing rictus. He saluted his soldiers, instructed them to take the fight to the traitors on the streets, and then permitted himself to be escorted into the Storm Raven's emergency medical suite. Calga survived that autumn day, his secondary heart saved by the apothecarium's secret arts, even though his primary heart had been cloven through. He was never seen on the battlefield again after that, but he continued to lead the Imperium soldiers from the heart of the Vigilus Senate. Though his stature had been lessened by the severe wounds he had received, his mind was as powerful and bright as ever. The Lord Macragge had denied Abaddon his prize through courage and honor rather than sheer force of arms. Though the departure of Abaddon and his elite provided some respite to many Imperial defenders, Vigilus remains plagued by violence. However, in the absence of Abaddon, several of the Chaos warbands have begun to adopt their own agendas and even fight one another. The conflict raged on at Megaborealis. The Mechanicum defenders from Styges VIII struggled with the World Eaters, and only the Iron Hands, who launched an artillery strike that slew all the insane Chaos Space Marines, saved the day. The Black Legion attacked Silo 15th on the western side of Mega Borealis, destroying much of its Blackstone stockpiles. The Mechanicum, on the other hand, had buried stockpiles of Blackstone across the world that the Chaos forces would never be able to find. The Blackstone deposits, together with VIGILUS' sister world of Sangua Terra on the other side of the Gauntlet, were able to keep the Nachmound Gauntlet open. Abaddon is still hoping to destroy the Nachmound Gauntlet by sending the deadly planet killer to Sangua Terra. Though Hyperia was still being fought over, the hive sprawls of Otek and Dirkton were officially declared lost. The Dark Eldar fought the Thousand Suns at Kalak's Bane, where they both used a concealed webway portal. The Drukhari are looking for at Kixatine Loop. The ruthless Xenos used stolen terraforming technology to summon Bizzards against their enemies. The confusion allowed them to smuggle hundreds of thousands of slaves back to Comora, including many Necropolis Hawk Space Marines. Meanwhile, with their mission completed and their honor restored by the deaths of the majority of the Aquilion Council, the Eldar elected to retire. Nobody knew what happened to Kruldaka's Speedwalk. Though the Orcs are now regarded a spent force in the cities, they remain a plague in Vigilus wastelands. 2/3 of their scrap cities survive. Word of a joyful fight has spread around the galaxy, energizing additional worlds in the Nachmund subsector to bloodshed. The Pauper Prince's Genestealers continue to infest Dirkton from top to bottom, but their plans for Vigilus are in shambles. The Xenos cultists are now desperately looking to the void, hoping that a Tyranid hive fleet will arrive to save them from their fate, so they wait. Imperial propaganda now claims that the conflict is almost over, and that it is always darkest before dawn. It's debatable how accurate this is, but it's evident that the hard road to recovery on Vigilus has begun. In the aftermath of Abaddon's withdrawal, Imperial commanders noticed little change on the ground. As Genestealers and Orcs rampaged across the planet, Chaos Space Marines continued their assault. Despite attacks from the Brazen Beasts, Genestealers and Orcs, the governing tech priests of Styges VIII refused to relinquish their Blackstone mining network at Mega Borealis Hive Sprawl. However, the Mechanicum quickly launched their own counterattack, launching Sicarian-class Skitari against the Greenskins into the mines. While the Skitari were initially effective, they became bogged down in subterranean ambushes by Genestealers. Meanwhile, in Hivesprawl Mortwald, the Black Legion and Demons of Slanesh continued to rampage, bypassing Imperial defense lines manned by tired Imperial Guard. The chem factories at Hivesprawl had long since halted production, and the outer defensive ring, formerly manned by Space Marines, was under attack from both Chaos and Orc forces. Numerous Imperial commanders thought Mortwald a lost cause when numerous Space Marines withdrew from the war zone. Human resistance, however, persisted in the face of Corpse King Rat, a former Hive gang boss who gained a series of improbable wins over Chaos forces. The Death Guard and Thousand Suns forces decimated Vigilus' capital, Hivesprawl of Hyperia, but quickly turned on one another. In these wars, the Hivesprawl suffered greatly, and warp anomalies saw massive disruptions that toppled entire hive spires seemingly at random. While the defense in Hyperia was skillfully maintained, Otek Hivesprawl was reported lost to Genestealer cults. In the face of Genestealer cult attacks, Dirkton Hivesprawl had also been abandoned, and conflict quickly erupted between the Xenos cultists and the scourged Chaos Space Marines. Storval had been lost at first, but relentless Skitari counterattacks were gaining ground against Orcs and Genestealers. Only Kalak's Bane, the southern industrial and water-producing zone, has managed to repel invaders. Despite this, water production was severely harmed by Dark Elder, Genestealer, and Chaos strikes. Warbands of Orcs continued to rampage with complete impunity in the wastelands, operating their fast-moving vehicles from vast trash cities. The most important of these was Fort Daka, Kruldaka's personal stronghold. The war boss' most recent plan was to expand his capital with an even larger fortress, and he desired a subterranean ancient stronghold that had been uncovered during conflicts between Abaddon's armies and the Dark Angels. However, the lair was occupied by the Iron Warriors chieftain Vengaz, and the Greenskins were soon pitted against hordes of demon engines. In space, the last Orc and Chaos Space Marine ships fought each other, while still posing a threat to any remaining Imperial cruisers. Chaos forces fought Genestealers for control of Vigilus' moon of Neovelum. Meanwhile, the word-bearers took over the satellite planetoid Hearthlack. Calga's injury had unintended implications for the Imperials. Rumors of his whereabouts spread across the Imperial ranks, and many assumed he was dead. Confusion prevailed, and the Imperial War Council, once commanded by Calga, disintegrated. Officers from the Space Marines and Imperial Guard broke into factions seeking their own wins, while many Imperial forces were discouraged by false stories of Calga's death. Out of despair and a desperate desire for survival in a scenario they felt bleak, some even sided with the Chaos and Genestealer cult forces. Simultaneously, the Adeptus Ministorum declared Calga a saint, and a cult sprung up around the injured chapter master. Meanwhile, removed Space Marines were frequently redeployed to adjacent worlds, believing Vigilus to be safe enough to defend the distant Nachmund subsector against enemy forces. Soon after, Imperial counterattacks were launched on Urastor, Yagdeth, Magna, and the Fundis Twins systems. Meanwhile, the Yolaris system, which lies along one of the Nachmound Gauntlet's few stable warp channels, was under attack from a massive Chaos fleet, which was reinforced by thousands of Sisters of Battle from the Order of the Bloody Rose, as well as 9 capital ships of the Imperial Navy and a horde of Frateris militia, Arco-flagellants, and penitent engines. Ecclesiarchy invasion cathedrams and a combination of donated ships joined the Imperial Navy vessels. It was termed the Crusade of Mina's Consecration and placed under the direction of the Ecclesiarchy under Canoness Corinne Rethnar. As they approached Mandeville Point, the Crusader fleet made good headway, but just as they arrived, a tremendous warp storm erupted, swallowing the system entire. The disaster killed 3 navigators, and the Mars-class battlecruiser Halo of Saul suffered a Gellerfield breakdown. The survivors worked in the warp for months, desperately looking for a way out, until the remaining navigators spotted the dim light of the astronomical clock. The Crusade fleet re-emerged into the Materium on the outskirts of the Vigilus system. Disgusted by what she discovered on the surface, Canoness Rethnar started a crusade towards Vigilus, where she, with the last Sororitas soldiers, launched a devastating counterattack, driving the Chaos Space Marines further south. Other piecemeal reinforcements that arrived in the system, such as the Vagashizari 87th Army Group and Inquisitor Erasmus Carter Volnus of the Ordo Malleus, joined the Crusaders. Carter Volnus believed he had identified the source of the Nachmound Gauntlet's disruptive effects in the form of blackstone structures known as noctilith crowns. The Inquisitor declared his desire to demolish these structures and cut the warp's connection to Vigilus. The Black Iconoclasts, an elite force of hand-picked experts recruited from a wide range of backgrounds, were under the direction of the Ordo Malleus. Carter Volnus initiated a quest for the crowns despite scant cooperation from the secretive Mechanicum. He eventually found one near Grisport on the southern edge of Megaborealis. The site was encircled by word-bearers cultists, as well as tech priests and serfs who had joined them. Carter Volnus took command of the outlying combat from the astonished Imperial Guard General as the Inquisition unleashed the Black Iconoclasts towards the Chaos flanks via Chimera transports. Carter Volnus launched the Imperial Guard in a sacrificial first wave, followed by his Black Iconoclasts. Carter Volnus utilized his psychic powers to break the Noctilith Crown, while his forces battled the Black Legion Marines around him. During his telepathic ritual to break the crown, he discovered several more, along with their locations. He then divided his forces into a variety of hidden armies, dispatching them to attack several crown positions with the requisitioned Imperial Guard, Sisters of Battle, and Imperial Fists forces already present on Vigilus. Carter Volnus led the best of the Black Iconoclasts to Storval, where he detected a nexus of the Noctilith Crown's power. He discovered hordes of diamond engines, brazen beasts, and chaos cultists attacking the tired Mechanicum House Raven, Sisters of Battle, and Imperial Guard defenses. A cabal of Black Legion warpsmiths and Masters of Possession kept the nexus that Karat Volnus sought near the volcano, known as Phaistos Mound. The Chaos armies used mass sacrifice and evil rituals to manufacture new Noctilith crowns from Blackstone, mined on Vigilus itself. Carter Volnus immediately established his dominance over the Imperial forces at Storval by torturing numerous captured officers and broadcasting their pain across the larger area. He subsequently launched a massive assault on Mount Phaistos, suffering terrible casualties among his requisitioned soldiers, but caring little. While the Imperials were bonded by faith and fear, the Chaos armies were fractured and frequently refused to help one another. This enabled Cartavolnus' soldiers to triumph and reach the volcano's top. When their offensive slowed, the Inquisitor himself, accompanied by his black iconoclasts, entered the fray and performed his ritual to seal the crown. Meanwhile, Imperial forces faced a difficult situation at Orgelnafa. The Imperial forces included the Mordian Iron Guard, Death Corps of Krieg, Santosh and Keruvar Imperial Guard, led by the Cadian 203rd Regiment under General Dosar. They were attacked by Chaos troops led by the Black Legion, whose Chaos Space Marines conducted guerrilla and special operations at first. Despite this, the Imperials were able to launch counterattacks and retake numerous cities from cultist hordes after arduous combat. The Imperial Guard was on the verge of victory until reinforcements from space arrived. As gunships dropped new Chaos Space Marines alongside tanks and demon engines, Chaos cruisers launched orbital bombardments that decimated Imperial defenses. The Imperial front had disintegrated within a week, and contact had been lost with General Dosar, whose Capital Imperialis command vehicle had been destroyed by Molafines and Raptors. Brigadier General Van Telos took command with Rear Admiral Farlan in space. They worked together to rearrange the fortifications and prevent a total defeat. However, the two were aware that Orgelnafa had been lost and sought to evacuate as much assets as possible from the planet. The Imperials surreptitiously planned to remove their most valuable assets, while using the Guard for several distracting and deceitful measures. However, word of the truth spread, and fear broke out among the Imperial ranks. Several Imperial spacecraft were lost in orbit, but the evacuation locations remained safe. The Imperial Navy left after doing everything they could, leaving 200,000 men behind. Their conflict was not ended, however, as more Imperial cruisers were lost to strikes by Chaos warships during the system's breakout. The event became known as the Orgelnafa massacre over time. The fleet desperately sought a haven within the warp, accidentally arriving at Vigilus thanks to its illuminating beacon within the Immaterium. Cartavolnus used the power of his presence and status on Vigilus to build some cohesion among the Imperial leaders. He was able to extract forces from Imperial Guard officers, Space Marine commanders, and Sisters of Battle leaders equally, and planned to use them to destroy the remaining crowns. Proctor Commander Threnedis of the Vigilant Guard was among them, having taken charge following the unexplained disappearance of her predecessor Veneda. Threnedis had made a name for herself during the war on Vigilus, even receiving accolades from the Space Marines. Cartavolnus was able to requisition the armies of Canoness Temperance Blaze through the order of our martyred lady. Cartavolnus began his work with these leaders monitoring his motley crew. The Inquisitor launched his second attack against dug-in word-bearer fortifications at the northern end of Otek Hivesprawl. Cartavolnus managed to fight his way past their lines while his Iconoclasts commander, Major Legance, launched a multi-pronged combined arms assault alongside Imperial Navy planes. Cartavolnus was able to fight his way to the Noctilith Crown at the middle of the Wordbearer's position and destroy it with Imperial Guard soldiers from the Talan Desert Raiders, Takan Ironmen, and Bullgrins. He then launched an attack on Borhive Ultrist, encountering heavy resistance from a small but experienced detachment of Black Legion Chaos Space Marines. Fighting lasted for weeks, and Cartavolnus was victorious once more, although his men suffered heavy losses. Undaunted, he moved on to the eastern borders of Mortwald, leading the 105/412 the Kachin Infantry Regiment, dubbed Jagger's Devilskins, into irrigation networks well protected by orcs and Genestilla cultists. The Catechans fought for days without coming across any Noctilith crowns. Cartavolnus recognized his psychic senses had failed him, causing a snafu in his schedule. Despite this setback, the Inquisitor had a considerable number of successes. The chaos and despair that had come with the Noctilith crowns began to diminish over Vigilus, bolstering Imperial morale and enabling for better communication. As the sacrifice on Vigilus continued, the ecclesiarchy supported a rising martyrdom cult that swept the world. The religious fervor peaked when it was rumored that Saint Celestine herself had arrived in Hyperia Hivesprawl, and it was this renowned figure who was able to unite Imperial defenders and eventually halt the Black Legion's march there. Tens of thousands of Imperial troops are claimed to have died in the ensuing defense of Saints Haven, but they eventually forced the Black Legion to withdraw. Celestine quickly left the area, reappearing at Megaborealis at the fort wall leading to Dontoria. Celestine met with Hrethnar of the Order of the Bloody Rose at Megaborealis and ordered the Order's whole global force to suspend activities to prepare for an attack on the corrupted city of Dontoria. Celestine personally conducted a ruthless purging of Dontoria after delivering a passionate speech to the assembled Imperial warriors. Celestine used orbiting warships to fire a deadly bombardment on the Poxwalkers, annihilating the huge hordes of these heretic creatures. The Sisters then advanced through Dontoria's outskirts, using their spacecraft in orbit to purify the entire artificial continent. The Celestine's efforts would be seen all the way to Terra, serving as a reminder to Chaos that Vigilus was not theirs to take. After Celestine's stand, much of Vigilus's command was restored. The Ecclesiarchy dominated the new command staff on Vigilus, which became known as the Synod Vigilant. Inquisitor Karat Volnus, his retinue, and those who had battled beside him fled, their job seemingly completed. During this phase of regeneration, Imperial forces conducted a major purge that cleansed much of the planet of its warp and Xenos taint. Because of the outpouring of faith, Imperial forces were re-energized, and Greenskin and Genstealer cult forces began to withdraw from the war zone. Many of the orbiting Orc warships had fled, leaving the remaining Orcs stranded, while the ambitious Bootstomper Galguts began his plan to create his biggest citadel atop an ancient stronghold discovered during the combat. Meanwhile, many more Genestealer fanatics remained, and began to plot how to exploit the religious fervor that was developing. A deep pit developed beyond the walls of Dontoria, and from it emerged the few cultists who had survived in Dontoria. While they were welcomed as a blessing by their relatives, they carried various terrible diseases that would infect other cult cells. The forces of Chaos were the Imperial's most numerous foes at this point. These were led by Lord Corval, the Night Spear of the Black Legion, and the sorcerer Zagramothis, as well as Borga the Red Hand, who had formerly served with the World Eaters. Abaddon had given them all orders to pursue the war as long as possible before his departure. Alpha Legion Master Omicron joined them, sending operatives into open-air religious sermons to create discord among the Imperial congregations. There were also the Iron Warriors of Warsmith Vezrax, who patrolled the system's outskirts and preyed on refugee ships leaving Mandeville Point. He hacked into the systems of these ships, transforming them into ghost ships that floated towards Vigilus as a distraction to attract Imperial forces away from their positions, allowing the Chaos Space Marine warbands to slaughter them. The Imperials were in a worse predicament at the northern end of the Nachmound Gauntlet. Dozens of worlds and outposts had been destroyed, and the Thought Ascendancy, a mercantile coalition of Vigilus nobility, had been decimated by a huge Chaos fleet. Chaos forces had also taken the Proxiton Rule shipyards, the mining colony beneath Vendigast, the star fort Gorheim, and St. Marnius's Halo's Ascension Disk. An Imperial fleet sent to relieve Kennet Majoris, consisting of 24 cruisers and 3 dozen escorts, simply vanished in a surge from the Great Rift at Quarth. Carter Volnus had slowed the rift's expansion, but it was still highly active. Vigilus was now alone, attacked but alive. Abaddon shifted his focus to the rest of the Nachmund Gauntlet, his gaze fixed on Daravar. And this is the end of the video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, leave a like and tell me in the comments section, what do you think about Vigilus? And what do you think the future holds for this key planet in the Imperium now divided? Thank you once again, and we will see each other on the next one. Until then, keep the light of the Emperor burning.
you.